Hey guys, it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens. I'm coming to you from my favorite spot in the entire planet, that is my garden. So behind me here, I do have several raised beds. This guy here is one of my yellow summer squash plants, and unfortunately, he is totally infected with powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a super common ailment that affects a lot of different types of squash plants, cucumber plants, many of your climbing plants, anything with a big broad leaf, really it can attach to. You may notice it on some of your other landscaping plants. Bee balm is super notorious for getting it as well. So despite the fact that it's a really common ailment, it can unfortunately really reduce the vitality of your plant, especially if you're trying to get a crop out of it. So in this case, my squash plant, I've seen it slow way down in its squash production this year. I definitely want to get that ramped back up. My top goals for today's video is to properly identify powdery mildew. What does it look like? Talk about what is powdery mildew, how does it spread, how can we prevent it, and of course, how do we treat powdery mildew when we already have it. So jumping right in, right behind me, I have one of my squash plants. Unfortunately, he is totally infected with powdery mildew. So how do I know that it's powdery mildew? First and foremost, it's a squash plant. So squash plants tend to be super susceptible to powdery mildew. A lot of my cucumbers will get it as well, different varieties of squash, anything that really climbs and has that big, broad green leaf is susceptible to this powdery mildew. Second of all, it's the time of year. So it's early fall for us here in northern Michigan. We're starting to see a lot more rain. We're getting cooler nights, and we are definitely getting some cloudier days, which means my plants are in the shade more often now than they were a month ago, and that causes moisture buildup in my raised beds. So I know that this is a time of year that I'm really susceptible to powdery mildew. I'm looking at a plant that's super susceptible to powdery mildew, and on top of it all, I'm seeing those classic white powdery looking spots on my leaves. All of those together cause me to draw the conclusion that this is in fact powdery mildew. Now, how do we treat powdery mildew? Of course, the easiest way to treat powdery mildew is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Now, this is easier said than done. I should have been spraying these plants with neem oil as a preventative measure way earlier on in the season. I didn't because life, So here I am now with powdery mildew. My plant is not yet dead. I am seeing a decrease in production. I'm seeing some yellowed leaves. I'm definitely seeing signs and symptoms that this powdery mildew is having a negative impact on my plant. So I need to do something about it. The single most effective way to get rid of powdery mildew is to use what we call neem oil. So neem oil comes from a neem tree, and this is an oil that is cold pressed out of the tree. This is a completely organic gardening product. You can use it on all of your food plants up until the day of harvest. It has a slight smell to it, kind of similar to almost a eucalyptus type smell or a tea tree oil type smell. So super earthy, really organic, very safe to use on all of your plants. It is a staple out in your garden. If you don't already have some, you absolutely need to buy some. So this is a brand that I tend to use. It's Harris brand, and I'll link it in the description below. This tiny little bottle can actually produce 12 gallons of neem oil because this is a concentrate. So I do recommend getting the concentrate so you can kind of mix up your own blends, because in certain circumstances, like my huge infestation behind me, I want to make sure that I'm doing a higher dose of neem oil than I normally would for preventative measures. So I went ahead and mixed up my neem oil slightly stronger than what the instructions recommend. Make sure you're labeling your bottles anytime you're dealing with chemicals out in the garden. You want to make sure you're using a spray bottle that has a nice wide broadcast on it to make sure you're hitting as much of the leaf as possible. So for the majority of this plant, we're going to go ahead and spray it with the neem oil to treat the powdery mildew, with just a few exceptions. This entire plant seems to be infected with this powdery mildew. So you can kind of see it on the majority of the large upper leaves. This guy has it really bad. Now, I do have one good thing to say, and that is the fact that I have so much beautiful new growth down here. So this plant is still living. It is still trying to produce additional growth. And what that tells me is this plant is healthy enough that I can remove some of these really infected larger leaves here and still be left with a really healthy, robust plant. So my first goal is going to be to go ahead and just prune off some of the leaves that are really infected and very large, just so we can eliminate more of the powdery mildew spores that are in this area. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off 3 leaves that I saw that were totally covered in this powdery mildew, top and bottom. And I want to just get them off of the plant and dump them way off in the woods so that the spores cannot affect any more of my plants around here. So I went ahead and just removed my worst offending leaves. This guy is classic powdery mildew. I'm going to put this on our homepage just so you can see if you have this on your leaves. It is 1000% powdery mildew, and neem oil is going to help you take care of it. So we have these leaves removed completely, and with my remaining healthy foliage, I'm going to take this neem oil and thoroughly spray both the tops and the bottoms and the stems of all of my remaining leaves. Now, one very important thing to note with the powdery mildew is a true fungus. It does spread via spores, which means if you have it in one section of your garden, it is very likely that you have it in another section of your garden. So we're coming over here. This is a totally different squash plant in a different raised bed. And sure enough, I can see evidence of the powdery mildew starting to form on some of these other leaves as well. So not only do I need to spray my leaves of the infected plant with neem oil, I also need to make sure I'm spraying every single squash plant or cucumber plant or pickle plant that I have in my garden. Even if the local plants that you have in that area are not showing signs or symptoms of powdery mildew, spray them anyway as a preventative measure. These things spread through spores, which means on your next windy day, they will likely find that other bed. Now, a super common question is how often should I spray for neem oil? This is absolutely done on a case-by-case basis. I have a really bad infection in this particular plant, so I'm actually gonna come back out and spray it again tomorrow, but I don't really wanna spray it every single day for a week in a row. As a general rule of thumb, once or twice a week should be enough to keep a normal infection under control, or if you're doing it on a preventative level, once a week is plenty. You do run the risk of sometimes burning the leaves with the neem oil if you're using too strong of a concentration or if you're spraying it too frequently. Now, of course, in this case, the benefits of spraying the plant twice in a row do outweigh the risks because this plant is already so far gone with the powdery mildew. At this point, I'm just trying to save it. Other things that you can do to help your plant recover from powdery mildew is understanding why it's there in the first place. So we're in our damp season here. I also have overhead watering for this particular section of my yard, so that's what we're working with. Now, as a result of the powdery mildew that I'm starting to see here, I'm going to reduce the watering to every other day instead of every day, which will help the soil more thoroughly dry out in between. Other steps I'm going to take is to remove some of the excess foliage, make sure there's good airflow that can get in between the plants. So removing some of these larger leaves like I did today should help increase some of that airflow that can get between the leaves and will help dry those out in between waterings as well. Other than that, you'll be surprised at how effective just checking on your plants every day can be. You'll notice little things like this happening way earlier on in the process, and it won't let them get as far as mine has gotten out here today. Anytime you're dealing with pests or diseases or anything along those lines with your plants, just checking on them daily and catching it early will be so much more effective than any treatment plan you can do afterwards. So learn from my mistake, go out and check on your garden at least a few times a week so you can catch your powdery mildew before it gets to this point. That's all I had for my video today. Super quick and easy tutorial. I hope that this effectively helps you identify and treat powdery mildew in your own garden. And more than ever, I just hope that it helps you prevent it in the future. If you have any questions for me on how I deal with any sort of pests or diseases out in my garden space, please leave them in the comment section below. As always, thanks so much for tuning in with us today, and I sure hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye.